Before the world knew her smile, before the billion-dollar box office and the red carpets, there was a little girl who stood on the edge of every room, silent, watching. A child whose life was rehearsed backstage instead of played on playgrounds. A girl named Sandra Bullock, born July 26, 1964, in Arlington, Virginia, the first breaths of a life that would teach her how to survive storms most of us can only imagine. She entered the world between two powerful forces. Her mother, Helga Meyer, was a celebrated German opera singer whose voice could fill the great halls of Europe. Her father, John Bullock, an American vocal coach and Army veteran, brought discipline and precision to every room he entered. In their house, music and structure ruled the day. While other children were learning to skip rope, Sandra was learning to stand still, to listen, to blend her small voice into rehearsals that demanded perfection. Even as a toddler, her playground was not a swing set but the wings of an opera stage. Costumes instead of dolls. Orchestra tuning instead of cartoons. While kids outside played tag, Sandra sat cross-legged behind velvet curtains, watching her mother rehearse arias in languages she barely understood. She learned early how to be invisible, how to slip through spaces without making a sound, skills that would later help her inhabit characters on screen with uncanny truth. By the age of 5, she was performing in children's choirs, tiny feet planted on cold stages, a fragile voice pushed to blend with the chorus. By 10, she had already lived in more German and Austrian cities than most Americans visit in a lifetime. Each move tore her away from classmates just as she began to belong. The cost of that constant uprooting was a growing ache she could not yet name, a sense that she was always arriving but never arriving anywhere she could stay. When the family returned to the United States in 1976, that ache sharpened into humiliation. Sandra walked into an American classroom wearing clothes from Europe that looked strange to her peers. Her accent clung to every syllable. The hallways echoed with laughter, not with her, but at her. What should have been the joy of finally coming home became years of quiet isolation. She learned to press her back against the wall, to stand at the edge of the room, to study faces before speaking. She learned that the world notices differences before it notices the heart. And yet, hidden inside that loneliness was a seed. Years later she would say that being the kid at the edge of the room taught her to see the other forgotten faces, to feel pain no one else noticed. That empathy, born from standing outside the circle, became the compass for her acting. It's why her characters, from Annie Porter on the bus and Speed to Lee and Tui in The Blind Side, feel like real people you know, not Hollywood constructs. She didn't have to pretend to be the outsider or the rescuer, she had lived both. In her childhood, German was the language of comfort, English the language of survival. Two identities pulled at her from opposite directions, never fully one, never fully the other. Her life felt like a split screen, Europe on one side, America on the other, and in the middle a girl silenced by sadness, trapped in shadows of both. But those wounds did not destroy her. They hardened into strength. Loneliness pressed itself into empathy. Instability reshaped into adaptability. Rejection became authenticity, the very quality Hollywood could never manufacture but always recognizes when it burns on screen. It's tempting to think hardship is always about poverty, but Sandra's early struggle wasn't about empty refrigerators or unsafe neighborhoods. It was emotional. It was about identity. About growing up with the weight of expectation instead of the lightness of play. Even with two loving, stable parents, she felt like a ghost in her own life, always moving, always adjusting, always bracing for the next departure. This tension between privilege and pain forged her earliest sense of self. She learned discipline from her father's military background. She absorbed the stamina of her mother's touring life. She learned to carry herself in public spaces with poise even when she felt small. All of those skills would later become invisible tools, the ones she drew on in auditions, on film sets, and eventually on award stages when the whole world was watching. At East Carolina University, where she eventually enrolled to study drama, she was already an observer. Friends remember her as warm but private, a student who could light up a room but also vanish into her own world. Even then, she was rehearsing not just lines but survival, how to navigate rooms full of strangers, how to keep her true self safe while showing just enough to get the part. If you look at photographs of Sandra as a teenager, you see it in her eyes, a mix of shyness and resolve. She isn't the prom queen archetype. She's the girl who knows there's something bigger out there, something she has to reach, even if it means standing alone. That drive would eventually pull her out of college a few credits shy of graduation, into the raw hustle of New York City. But before we get to that leap, it's important to understand the crucible that shaped her, a childhood of movement and music, of discipline and displacement, of watching from the wings. Because that is the secret of section 1 of her story. Sandra Bullock's resilience didn't begin when she was famous. It began when she was 5 years old, standing in a children's choir on a European stage, already learning how to perform under pressure. It began when she was 12, being mocked in an American hallway for an accent she couldn't drop. It began every time she packed a suitcase and said goodbye before she was ready. Those early years gave her 2 priceless gifts. The first was adaptability, the ability to walk into any room, any city, any audition, and read it fast. The second was empathy, the instinct to notice who's hurting, who's invisible, who needs a hand. Combined, they became her trademark on and off screen, a woman who can play a bus driver, a beauty pageant contestant, an astronaut lost in space, or a mother opening her home, and make you believe every second. So when you watch Sandra Bullock later, dazzling on screen or carrying an Oscar down the red carpet, remember this: behind the glamour is a girl who learned very young how to stand at the edge of the room and still shine. She built her career not on a silver spoon but on a childhood of constant rehearsal, for music, for movement, for survival. And that's where her journey truly begins. A child forged by discipline and displacement, preparing, without knowing it, for a life that would demand both. In the next chapter, we'll follow her out of college and into the unforgiving streets of New York, where she traded security for a dream and began the climb from anonymity to breakout star. She could have stayed. She could have finished her degree at East Carolina University, collected her diploma, and stepped into a safe, predictable life. But safety had never been Sandra Bullock's goal. After years of being the outsider, she wanted more than applause from classmates. She wanted a stage big enough to carry every ounce of her hunger. In 1986, just a few credits shy of graduating, she packed a suitcase and took a one-way ticket to New York City. What she found was not the New York of movie montages. It was winter. Bitter, gray, and merciless. Rent chewed through the small savings she had. There were no famous names opening doors for her, no rich uncles in the industry, no friends slipping her into auditions. She was simply a 22-year-old with a southern drawl, a German middle name, and a dream that looked ridiculous on paper. She worked nights as a bartender, waitress, coat checker, anything to cover rent. Her apartment was barely bigger than a walk-in closet. The pipes clanged. Heat sputtered and failed. Dinner was often instant noodles with bitter coffee, her body running on exhaustion and sheer will. She refused to ask her parents for help. "I wanted to prove I could do it on my own," she would later tell interviewers. It was not stubbornness so much as survival. If she accepted rescue now, she feared she would never build the muscle she needed to endure Hollywood later. Days were for auditions. She took acting classes at the neighborhood playhouse, rode the subway to cattle calls, and memorized sides for plays that would never be produced. Sometimes she would rehearse lines in the dark after her shift, whispering to herself while the city outside roared. The late 1980s offered her only shadows of recognition. Tiny parts in off-Broadway shows. Films like Hangman and Religion Incorporated that came and went without notice. Posters faded. Reels collected dust. Nobody cared. Nobody was watching. But each no became a kind of training. Every silence sharpened her resolve. She learned how to audition without apologizing. How to take a rejection and walk out taller. How to keep her soul intact while scraping by. These were not glamorous years, but they were the forge where she learned discipline and resilience. Years later she'd say, "I learned more from the no's than I ever did from the yes." She also learned something subtler, how to make herself memorable in rooms full of forgettable faces. Casting directors might not hire her, but they would remember the energy. She started to find her own rhythm, a mix of warmth, wit, and authenticity that felt different from the plastic sheen of other hopefuls. It was this quality, invisible but unmistakable, that eventually got her noticed. The first flicker came in 1993 with Demolition Man, where she played opposite Sylvester Stallone and Wesley Snipes. It wasn't the starring role, but for the first time she was in the frame with megastars. Audiences began to ask, "Who's that?" Studios began to scribble her name on lists. And Sandra felt something she hadn't felt in years, a spark. That spark ignited 1 year later. Speed, 1994, was an action film about a city bus rigged with explosives, a high-concept thriller in search of a leading lady. The role of Annie Porter had been written for other actresses. Halle Berry even circled some of Hollywood's brightest names. Sandra was not on the list. But she auditioned anyway, walking into the room with nothing but a folding chair and a paper plate for a steering wheel. No glamour. No pretense. Just raw, vulnerable, utterly real. Across from her sat Keanu Reeves. Their chemistry was instant, electric, undeniable. The studio executives couldn't look away. Suddenly, the woman who had spent years serving drinks and memorizing lines in a freezing apartment was the heartbeat of a $30 million thriller. Speed exploded at the box office, hauling in more than $350 million worldwide. Overnight, Sandra Bullock went from anonymous driver to Hollywood's new star. The transformation was surreal. 1 week she was worrying about rent, the next she was on magazine covers. But beneath the headlines, she still carried the same hunger. She had not waited tables for nothing. She knew how quickly a spotlight could turn cold. So instead of basking in celebrity, she treated her breakout as a launchpad. In 1995, with While You Were Sleeping, she proved she could conquer comedy as gracefully as action, cementing herself not just as a fluke but as a true leading lady. Looking back, the arc from that New York apartment to Speed is more than a career jump. It's a lesson in endurance. Sandra Bullock didn't arrive in Hollywood by chance. She stormed it, built brick by brick from rejection, humiliation, and nights of ramen noodles. She took instability and shaped it into adaptability. She took invisibility and turned it into authenticity. She built the very qualities that would make her irreplaceable when her moment finally came. So when you watch her defuse a bomb on a bus or fall in love in a romantic comedy, remember the young woman behind the scenes, the one who left college without a degree, who worked double shifts, who carried lines in her head like prayers. That is the Sandra Bullock you're seeing, the outsider who turned every no into fuel, every setback into grit, until one day the world couldn't look away. And in the next chapter, she'll do something even harder. She'll use that hard-won stardom not just to act but to produce, to shape her own destiny, to risk humiliation again in order to tell stories she believes in. But before we get there, pause for a moment on the image of her at that Speed audition, a folding chair for a bus seat, a paper plate for a steering wheel, because in that moment you can see the whole journey, the girl at the edge of the room, finally stepping into the center. The headlines called her America's sweetheart. Speed had blown open the doors. While You Were Sleeping had proved she wasn't a one-note action heroine. By the mid-1990s, Sandra Bullock was everywhere, magazine covers, late-night talk shows, blockbuster openings. But behind that smiling image was a mind already plotting something bigger. She wasn't content to just be the passenger in other people's stories. She wanted to steer the bus. Hollywood at that moment was still a system built to keep actresses in boxes, the ingenue, the comic relief, the aging starlet. Sandra had watched how quickly it could turn on you. She'd clawed her way into the spotlight, now she was determined to keep control of what happened next. And she understood something many of her peers did not: fame is temporary, but ownership is power. So while she was still being crowned as the new queen of romantic comedy, Sandra quietly founded her own production company, Fortis Films, in 1995. The name was a hint of her intent. Fortis means strong in Latin. It was her way of declaring, I will not just be cast, I will cast myself. She signed a bold studio deal and began shaping the kinds of stories she wanted to tell: hopeful, funny, empathetic, led by women who were messy and real. The first fruits of that gamble were films like Hope Floats, Miss Congeniality, and 2 Weeks' Notice. Each one a box office success. Each one carrying her fingerprints as both star and producer. She wasn't just showing up to play the role. She was developing the scripts, hiring directors, and crafting marketing campaigns. By the early 2000s, Sandra Bullock had become one of the few actresses in Hollywood who could both headline a film and own a piece of it. And she didn't stop at the big screen. Fortis Films reached into television, producing the long-running sitcom George Lopez. At a time when few white A-list stars were backing Latino-led projects, Sandra quietly wrote the checks and opened the doors. The show ran for 6 seasons and remains one of the most-watched Latino comedies ever broadcast, a testament to her instincts and her willingness to use her clout for others. On screen, she kept proving her range. One year she was a beauty pageant undercover cop in Miss Congeniality, blending slapstick with vulnerability. Another year she was trading barbs with Hugh Grant in 2 Weeks' Notice. Audiences fell for her combination of self-deprecating humor and emotional authenticity. She could take a rom-com cliché and make it feel lived in. She could take an action premise and make it feel human. That was her superpower. But Hollywood always tests its darlings. In 1997 she returned for Speed 2, Cruise Control without Keanu Reeves. The budget ballooned, the story faltered, and critics pounced. The audience stayed away. For the first time since her breakout, Sandra's name was attached to a flop. She later laughed about it, joking in interviews, "I think only 5 people liked that movie." But behind the humor was a sting. She had only agreed to do Speed 2 in exchange for the chance to make Hope Floats, a film she believed in with her whole heart. It was classic Sandra: risk failure, even ridicule, for the chance to tell a story that matters to you. That pattern, daring, falling, and climbing again, became her signature. She refused to coast on her sweetheart persona. She produced. She negotiated. She took pay cuts to protect budgets and profit shares to secure back-end deals. By the early 2000s, she was one of the highest-paid women in Hollywood, not because she played the game but because she changed it. Look closely at her choices and you'll see a theme: agency. In Miss Congeniality, her character isn't just the ugly duckling who becomes a swan, she's an FBI agent who owns her intelligence and her flaws. In 2 Weeks' Notice, she isn't a passive love interest, she's a principled lawyer holding her ground. Even in her lightest comedies, Sandra was modeling women who steer their own lives, just as she was steering hers. And then there's her impact off-screen. She became known for hands-on philanthropy long before celebrity charity was fashionable, quietly donating millions to disaster relief, scholarships, and children's hospitals. She didn't tweet about it. She just wrote the checks and moved on. It was the same instinct she'd honed as a child on the margins: see who's hurting, step in, help. By the end of this period, Sandra Bullock had transformed from a breakout star into a multi-hyphenate powerhouse. She had built a production company, bankrolled a hit sitcom, headlined multiple box office winners, and weathered her first major flop without losing her audience. She had turned America's sweetheart from a limiting label into a platform for ownership and influence. So when you think of Sandra Bullock in the late 1990s and early 2000s, don't just picture the tiara and gown of Miss Congeniality. Picture the woman behind the scenes, sitting in meetings with studio heads, hammering out contracts, betting on projects no one else would back. Picture her taking the hard lessons of New York and applying them to Hollywood, using her outsider's resilience to build a place at the table that no one could take away. Because the next chapter of her story will test that resilience even more. Awards, betrayals, motherhood, heartbreak, all of it waiting just beyond the spotlight. But for now, at the height of her sweetheart era, Sandra Bullock had done something few actresses ever manage. She had turned fame into power. She had learned how to steer the bus. By 2009, Sandra Bullock had been a star for nearly 2 decades. She'd conquered action, rom-coms, and producing. Yet she still hadn't stood on the Academy Awards stage. That would change with a single role, a part that drew directly from the empathy forged in her own childhood, Lee and Tui in The Blind Side. It was the story of a wealthy Southern woman who opens her home to a homeless teenager, helping him find a future. On screen, Sandra brought a fierce tenderness to the role, a steel-spine protector who could also open her heart. The performance was a revelation. Critics who had pigeonholed her as America's sweetheart suddenly saw her as a serious dramatic actress. Audiences poured into theaters. The film grossed more than $300 million worldwide and became a cultural touchstone. And then, the culmination, the 82nd Academy Awards, March 7, 2010. Sandra walked onto the stage in a shimmering Marchesa gown to accept the Oscar for Best Actress. She spoke with humor and humility, honoring moms who take care of kids who aren't theirs. Cameras flashed, the crowd roared, and for a fleeting moment it looked like every struggle, the ramen dinners, the auditions, the long climb, had led to this peak. But what the cameras didn't show was the secret folded into her clutch that night, a pair of tiny green socks belonging to a 3-month-old baby boy named Louis. Only weeks earlier, in January 2010, Sandra had walked through her front door cradling the infant she had just adopted from New Orleans. In her heart, she believed she was stepping into a new life, 2 parents, 1 home, a future that felt solid at last. She and her husband Jesse James had begun the adoption process together. Oscar night was supposed to be a coronation of both career and family. 10 days later, the fairy tale imploded. Tabloid headlines erupted with revelations of Jesse's infidelity. The same press that had celebrated her triumph turned merciless, splashing betrayal across every front page. Instead of introducing her son to the world beside a supportive husband, she was signing divorce papers with one hand and rocking her baby to sleep with the other. The Oscar that should have been a crown of joy became a cruel reminder of heartbreak. Sandra never lashed out publicly. There were no revenge interviews, no scripted tears. She went silent, withdrawing from the noise to protect her child. How do you process grief and not hurt your child in the process, she later reflected. That wasn't philosophy. It was survival. In midnight feedings and whispered lullabies, she built a cocoon of love around Louis, refusing to let him taste even a drop of her despair. In that choice lay her greatest victory, not the golden statue on a shelf, but the quiet triumph of a mother turning devastation into devotion. It's easy to forget how brutal that moment was. Paparazzi camped outside her gates like vultures. Headlines mocked her personal life even as they praised her acting. The irony was searing. The woman celebrated for playing a mother who gave a child a home was forced to become a single mother at the very moment her own home collapsed. But Sandra had weathered storms before. She understood how to stand at the edge of a room. She knew how to turn rejection into fuel. This time she turned heartbreak into resolve. She poured her energy into shielding Louis from the chaos, giving him the stability she herself had longed for as a child. No grandstanding. No tabloid battles. Just quiet, steady parenting. While the world debated whether she was America's sweetheart or America's victim, Sandra was changing diapers and learning to be a mother on her own terms. Music shifts, lower, more intimate. This period marks the hinge in her story. Up to this point, Sandra Bullock's narrative had been about climbing, from outsider to breakout star, from actress to producer, from box office darling to Oscar winner. With The Blind Side she reached the summit. And yet within days, life reminded her that no amount of fame or fortune can shield you from betrayal or loss. But what she did next would define her far more than any award. She stayed grounded. She focused on Louis. She refused to be defined by scandal. In doing so, she modeled a different kind of power, the power of dignity, the courage to walk away quietly and rebuild your life without spectacle. That quiet strength, forged in her childhood and sharpened in New York, became her anchor in the storm. So when you see the clip of Sandra Bullock holding her Oscar, don't just see a golden statue. See the hidden socks tucked into her clutch, the secret baby waiting at home, the betrayal she had yet to discover. See a woman standing at the highest point of her career and the lowest point of her personal life at the same time, and choosing love over bitterness, motherhood over drama. Because the next chapter in her journey isn't about trophies or box office at all. It's about survival of a different kind, facing a stranger inside her own home, wrestling with fear, and slowly learning how to heal from the invisible scars. By 2014, Sandra Bullock had rebuilt much of her life. She was raising Louis largely out of the spotlight, focusing on work she believed in and carving a quieter rhythm for herself. After betrayal and public humiliation, she had found a measure of peace. But fate has a way of testing the walls we think will keep us safe. June 8, 2014. A hot, still night in Los Angeles. Sandra returned to her home drained from a long day. Louis was staying safely with his nanny for the night. The house was silent, the kind of silence that usually promises rest. But just after 1 a.m., that silence cracked. First a faint sound. Then closer. At first she thought it was coming from the workout room. Then it moved. Her chest tightened. Someone was inside. Alone, she locked the bedroom door, fled into her closet, and dialed 911 with trembling hands. On the recording later released to the public, her voice is a whisper, steady but shaking with the knowledge that she no longer owned her own home, that safety had been stripped away. Every second dragged like an eternity. Behind that door was not just an intruder. It was the brutal truth that walls, gates, and alarms cannot keep terror from slipping through the cracks. The man who had entered her home, Joshua Corbett, was a stranger who had stalked her for days, leaving notes and watching from the shadows. In his bag were clippings of her face and a letter that blurred delusion with obsession. He owned multiple firearms. He carried none that night, but the true weapon was the terror he left behind. The police arrived and arrested him. Physically, Sandra was unharmed. But the scars were invisible. Panic would strike out of nowhere. Tears came from something as simple as looking out a car window. She admitted later she unraveled, her body replaying the night again and again. What tormented her most was not her own fear but the possibility that Louis might feel it too, that her son would inherit tremors not written in blood but in silence. So she turned to therapy, specifically EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, a technique often used for trauma. Piece by fragile piece, she reclaimed her peace, not just for herself, but for the little boy who deserved to grow up unshadowed. It wasn't a quick process. Trauma doesn't dissolve on command. But she was determined. The same discipline that had gotten her through endless auditions and heartbreak now guided her through healing. She learned to breathe through panic, to reset her nervous system, to make her home feel safe again. This chapter of her life reveals something deeper than any role she's played. Even the brightest stars are not immune to darkness, but the bravest are the ones who fight to heal. Most celebrities would have buried the story, hired more security, and never spoken of it again. Sandra did add security, but she also spoke publicly about her PTSD. She destigmatized seeking help, especially for survivors who think they're supposed to be strong. It was an act of quiet leadership. All the while she was still raising Louis. She kept his world as stable and joyful as she could, school runs, pancakes in the morning, bedtime stories at night. She wanted him to remember a mother who was present and calm, not haunted. That decision, to do the inner work so your child doesn't have to carry your ghosts, is its own kind of heroism. No movie cameras. No applause. Just the hard, private labor of healing. By the mid-2010s, Sandra had survived 3 storms most people never face: betrayal under the harshest spotlight, rebuilding herself as a single mother, and now an invasion of her own sanctuary. Yet she was still working, still creating, still opening her heart. The role she chose began to carry a new depth, less about physical heroics and more about emotional survival. It's no coincidence that after the home invasion she gravitated toward parts that explored isolation and resilience, like the astronaut in Gravity and the blindfolded mother in Bird Box. Those performances resonated because they weren't just acting. They were transmuting lived experience. Audiences felt the authenticity because it was there, the knowledge of what it means to be alone in the dark, to feel hunted, to keep moving anyway. And in telling those stories, Sandra was also reclaiming her own narrative. She was proving to herself and to the world that fear may scar you, but it does not get the last word. So when you see her later, floating untethered in gravity or clutching her children in Bird Box, remember that behind the fiction was a real woman who had hidden in her own closet, whispering to a 911 operator. Remember that she didn't just survive a break-in, she turned it into a catalyst for healing, for becoming an even more present mother, an even more fearless artist. This chapter closes with Sandra on firmer ground, a survivor who has faced both public and private dangers and is still standing. But life's twists weren't done with her yet. In the next phase, she'll discover a love she thought she'd lost forever and build a family more complete than she dared hope. And then, once again, fate will test the sanctuary she's built. After years of heartbreak, betrayal, and rebuilding, Sandra Bullock had learned to live with her guard up. She poured herself into motherhood, work, and healing. But there was still an ache, an emptiness only real companionship could fill. By 2015, she was a woman who had survived almost everything. Yet she had not stopped hoping for ordinary happiness, laughter over breakfast, someone to lean on at the end of the day. That hope walked into her home in the most un-Hollywood way. Not at a premiere, not at a gala, but at a birthday party. Photographer Brian Randall had been hired to capture Lewis's 5th birthday in 2015. He arrived with his camera, expecting a job. Sandra, the woman the world adored as America's sweetheart, met someone who did not see the star, the Oscar winner, or the box office queen. He saw her, simply her. What began as a professional hire quickly deepened into something neither of them had expected, a bond so natural it felt as if it had been waiting all along. Brian, once a model-turned-photographer, brought with him the wisdom of fatherhood. He had a daughter of his own, and with that came patience, gentleness, and an instinctive understanding of love's responsibilities. For the first time in years, Sandra found herself letting someone into the private world she had built around Lewis. As their relationship grew, Sandra soon expanded her heart again, this time with Brian by her side. Later in 2015 she adopted Layla, a brave little girl from foster care who had already endured more hardship than any child should. Brian stepped into that moment not just as Sandra's partner but as a father figure, matching her devotion with his own warmth. To the children, he wasn't just mom's boyfriend. He was the fun parent, the steady presence, the one who made ordinary moments sparkle with humor and tenderness. Though Sandra and Brian never married, their commitment was no less profound.